Thank you very much. It was a great pleasure to be here. So I'll talk about a little bit about registered reports, which you probably mainly know about, but I'll just say some details about how they work, why they work, why I think they do the job that they do, and how they could be improved. And then in talking about the improvement, talk about how the whole publishing, the approach to scientific publishing could be improved, and an experiment that seems to be working in shaking up how publishing is done. So first of all, just to clear up some terminology, although I realize many of you probably know it. So there's a difference between pre-registration and the registered report. Pre-registration is something you can, any of you can do at any time. You just go onto OSF and you write up what your hypotheses were, what analyses you're going to do to test those hypotheses, and what conclusions you would come to based on different results. The amount of detail and exactly what you say is completely up to you. So on the one hand, that flexibility means if you're not used to thinking that way, planning in advance your studies, which I don't know what you're taught, but I remember in the 80s when I was taught statistics by John Keir, a statistician, he said you should always plan your statistics in advance, because no one really did in those days. So we're now finally getting back to doing what we're told we should have been doing for decades. But now, when you do a pre-registration, the extent to which this is beneficial is just sort of depends on what you put into it, and how closely you stick to your pre-registration or make explicit you've departed from it. And studies have shown, when you look at the extent to which people have followed pre-registrations, that it isn't always very close. And when people have departed from them, they often haven't said that they've departed from them. So to that extent, the pre-registration doesn't produce any particular benefits. The registered report is an attempt to nail down that process, to make sure it's working rigorously, and to do it in a very formal way. Nonetheless, in my lab, we pretty much always, we have a policy to pre-register before any study. And I think once you've been through the registered report process, that's a training in how you can pre-register in a very thorough and rigorous way. So even when I'm not doing registered report, I treat pre-registrations as if I were doing a registered report with that degree of seriousness. And for example, that would mean having a results section that says, these are the pre-registered analyses. These are the non-pre-registered analyses that are clearly separated, even when it's not in the context of a registered report. So registered reports were introduced about 10 years ago in Cortex, largely the work of Chris Chambers, who's been an unstoppable juggernaut in pushing through registered reports, so that now there's over 300 journals that do registered reports, and all scientific disciplines and even humanities are now covered by registered reports somewhere. So what happens in a registered report is you start the process before you collect the data, including it's an official journal article type. You get a review on your proposal, the logic of what you're doing, whether the predictions follow from the theory, whether the analyses will test those predictions, or the best way of testing those predictions. Now, a crucial thing is, because this happens before the data is collected, the dynamics of the relationship between the authors, the reviewers, and the editor are completely changed compared to the standard article, to become more collaborative, precisely because nothing's been done yet. So that means everybody can chip in and shape the way this study is going to happen to make it the best it could be. Unlike the conventional article, where if you've used some behavioral measure or something, and someone says, well, no, that's not a very good behavioral measure, it should be this other one. Well, it's too late. You've already done what you're going to do. So that encourages the authors to dig their heels in and say, no, it should be this way. And you get more of a, potentially more of a combative type feel to it. Well, it does feel very different with the registered report because, as I say, it's a collaboration, and so you're now in the position to get advice from people who might be coming at this from a different perspective, have different knowledge background, and to utilize that in constructing the best experiment that it could be. Then in the classic case, the data has not been collected yet. When that stage one has been accepted, you then go off and collect the data, and the stage two is the report of the results, following the procedure you said you would follow, analyzing it in the way you said you'd analyzing it. But you are entitled to have, people often do, another results section, which is the non-pre-registered analyses, because something might occur to you, an illuminating way of analyzing data might be some other way. That's fine. You report that in the non-pre-registered analysis section. So it doesn't stop these other analyses, but in a registered report, the abstract has to follow the conclusions from the pre-registered analysis, and the discussion must put center stage of the pre-registered analysis. But you can talk about the other analyses. So that's a registered report. Why would one do that? Well, here's a view of science seen from a certain grain, a certain level of magnification. You have a theory you want to test, maybe global workspace theory. You make some predictions that would apply to a certain experimental paradigm. I've called them phenomena here. You then collect some data and you get evidence for or against those predictions. So now what happens when that process is reconstructed in the light of data, in writing up an article in the light of the data? Well, what I think we have here is a certain set of objective relationships that exist between theory, its predictions, and the data. So given a certain theory, there are certain predictions that follow from it, either simply or with scientifically justified assumptions. And given the data, there's the data have a certain evidential bearing on those predictions. I think those relations are objective in the sense we can be wrong about them. We can misrepresent that state of affairs. So if you try and make those, try and represent those relationships in light of the data, one thing that can go wrong is p-hacking. So now the apparent way the data bear on the predictions, it doesn't represent the way they truly bear on those predictions, but it's a misrepresentation. So the apparent evidence is no longer really evidential. This is, of course, particularly, the problems have been shown with behavioral studies, right? So this first came up with behavioral priming, which in a way is very simple. Now you take fMRI, it's very complicated. So the scope for p-hacking in fMRI is vaster, and so the problem is even more acute in cognitive neuroscience generally. And then the relationship of the theory to the predictions can become misrepresented. So you may have noticed Takwan now getting upset about this very point in terms of what predictions does information integration theory actually make about the brain areas that are relevant to conscious experience? Well, there are some, what one would like to know are some, what can be derived from the theory. Okay. How do I do that? Let's see. So now, when you reconstruct what predictions you have in the light of the data, you might misrepresent the actual relationships. Gelman wrote a nice paper on this, the Garden of Forking Paths, where he took some papers and he looked at the predictions at the end of the introduction, and there might be some complex interaction. And he said, well, actually, I can derive a simpler prediction from the theory stated in this paper, a prediction that turns out not to be supported by the data, but this complex interaction was. And that's the only reason the authors gave this complex interaction as their prediction at the end of the introduction. And you've probably had that experience yourself when you read the paper and you come to the end of the introduction, and then you see the predictions there, and you say, well, I know why you made that prediction. It's because that's what the results were, and it sort of jumps out at you. Or what you can do is simply drop theory and say, well, if we're going p-hacking, we can just fish for some results. Not that an absence of theory is necessarily a bad thing, because natural history is a part of science. But I think psychologists, anyway, have been too quick to drop theory and just to fish around when there are interesting theories about to be tested. So writing a paper in the light of data can lead to p-hacking or b-hacking. You can do the same with Bayes factors. Bayes factors not immune to this, which means the data are no longer evidential regarding phenomena. The predictions may no longer simply follow from the theory, so the predictions no longer bear on the theory. So what can we do about that? Well, what we can do is, if you're in a situation, and science isn't always being in precisely this situation, but it is a part of science, and you sometimes will be in a situation where you have some theory to test, you can make predictions from it, and you want to test those predictions, then you can do a registered report. So that's a situation where the registered report is useful because it enables this scientific process to be constructed without the biases in reasoning and judgment that are made when you try and look at these objective relationships in the light of the data, which us as researchers, being only human, tend to make us want to misconstrue those relationships to get what we want. Now, we don't actually need a clear theory to get the benefits of a registered report. I'm just saying one of the benefits you get from a registered report is having a less biased way of construing what predictions follow from theories, because you're judging that before the data are in. But if you didn't have a theory, it could just be estimation, or it could be having more of a look around without a theory there. You can still get the benefit of the registered report because of the other biases, namely p-hacking and so on, that it controls for. Now, cognitive neuroscience is an area where registered reports do happen. I see quite a few in EEG, but not in fMRI. So this is an area where we as a community could do more work. And I realise why it's difficult. At Sussex, some people decided what they'll do to deal with the difficulty in fMRI is run a pilot first, use that as the basis for the pre-registration of the protocol and the analytic pipeline, and then run the main confirmatory study after that. Of course, that's more expensive, but then that enables you to get the benefits of a registered report. Well, I say the benefits. Is there any evidence that there are benefits? When you look at psychology papers like Skill et al. Here, which are normal article types, and you look at the extent to which the predictions at the end of the introduction are confirmed, then it's close to 100%. Allen and Miller was more broader and not just psychology, but they get similar figures. So that's quite astounding, really, that apparently psychologists can intuit how the mind works just by sitting down and thinking about it. It's barely worth doing any experiments if we're really that good at it. So I doubt that's really how it is. With registered reports, that the rate of predictions being confirmed comes to less than 50%. So that's a massive change. And I think it's reasonable to think that that's closer to what it should be if there were no biases operating. So I think that shows a registered report. That's good evidence that registered reports do reduce biases in scientific reasoning. Registered reports also have higher computational reproducibility. By that I mean, if you take the data that the open data paper links to, can you reproduce from that very same data the results in the results section? So there have been a number of papers showing that in psychology, there is a massive computational reproducibility problem. Often results, in fact, a majority of the time, results don't reproduce even in what you think of high prestige journals like Psychological Science. In fact, what I've done at Sussex is we ran a pilot for a year where I hired a statistician to be a reproducibility statistician. So any of us could send our papers, which are about to be submitted, but before we submit them, we send them to Rennie. She'll take the raw data we link to and attempt to reproduce all the tables, figures, results and conclusions that are in the paper. And she almost always finds mistakes. And another thing about people going through this process with Rennie is she makes sure that open data is open, because it isn't really open unless someone can use it and knows how to use it and they know what the columns mean. And it can, in fact, be used to check the reproducibility of your results. And that turns out to be a far harder task than most people realize. So people going through this process of going through a reproducibility statistician learn how to make open data genuinely open, transparent, and usable. But we had her for a year. That finished in December, and it was a sufficient success in the sense there was enough uptake by researchers, which I didn't know in advance there would be. And she's now hired full-time and permanently as our reproducibility statistician for the School of Psychology at Sussex. Anyway, that was a slight aside, but I just sort of wanted to push that idea because I think that would be a good thing if it took off generally in the academic community to have such a thing as a reproducibility statistician. And on that, incidentally, Rennie says she prefers doing that work than being a regular academic. So it opens up a sort of another career track for people within academia rather than the regular academic one that some people would actually prefer. When you try and blind papers as to whether they're registered reports or not, the blinding wasn't terribly successful in terms of the academics rating these papers were fairly good at guessing which was which, but they do rate the methodological rigor being higher in registered reports than in regular articles. And both of these signs of quality make sense given, I think, that when you do a registered report, as I say, it's a collaborative process with reviewers and authors and editors working on this to make this the best piece of work that they can for addressing the question that you wish to address. Okay, so far so good. Registered reports are still a minority article type, but they're exponentially growing. But there are problems with them. One is stage one review time. This can put people off. What I mean by that is you can't start collecting data, right, until you've been through this review for your proposal. So you can't just say, oh, I've got an idea, let's start collecting data on it. And that review time is the same review time as you'd have with a regular article, because it goes to some reviewers, they'll have some questions, you'll answer it. Maybe it's accepted then, like with a regular article, but more likely it'll come back to you and with some more queries, so you send it back again, then maybe it's accepted at that point, or maybe there's one more round of review. So there's several months of review time there before you even get going. I do want to say, though, that doesn't mean that the entire process is lengthened. It's because the stage two review time is very quick. The reviewers don't have to do much. So they just need to check that you did do what you said you're going to do and that you drew reasonable conclusions from that. And that tends to be a very quick process. So what happens with a registered report is the lengthy review time, which is normally at the end of the research process, now happens towards the beginning. But that is often enough to put people off, and sometimes just isn't feasible given when you have to do certain things to get a job done. Now, you might think, what I'd rather do is to see what results I get, because if they're really sexy, I can get it in a high prestige journal. Whereas in a registered report, you commit to the journal before you get your results. You don't know how sexy they're going to be. You might think, well, if they're going to be really sexy, I might have gotten a really good journal. Now, you could say that's one of the advantages of, or the key advantage of a registered report is precisely that you promise publication before the sexiness of the results is known, but it does have this side effect. Now, registered reports in journals have been of the one study version, where you submit a protocol for one study, you get your reviews and your so on, and then you get the results for that one study, then you publish one study. You might say it's a very lengthy process for one study, and in any case, you might have a whole program of a series of studies to do, which sort of come as a package. And wouldn't it be good to be able to go through this process in one step for the whole series? So in journals at the moment, that's not possible. Registered reports require thinking about things in a novel way. The simple process of reviewing before the results are in doesn't sound maybe like that much, but it does change how you look at things, because it means you can tighten up everything about the design of the study, including things like, is there sufficient power? If you're doing Bayesian analyses, are you going to run enough subjects to be able to get an extreme enough Bayes factor to draw the sort of conclusions that would be worthwhile? So that forces you to think about things like, well, what is the logic of calculating power? How does one do this properly? How do I, for a Bayes factor, what sort of prior should be used? How does one justify that? So there's a number of things, or you might be using something like equivalence testing, in which case you have to justify a minimal interesting effect size. How does one justify that scientifically? So it throws up a number of issues that suddenly become just that much more salient because you're doing it all in advance and you're planning things properly. Do editors know about all this? So all those registered reports, those 350 journals out there that do registered reports, do the editors know what they're doing? There have been problems with stage 1 protocols not being publicly available. But if the stage 1s are not available, it should be the case that anybody can check, did this final version match what they said they're going to do? That should be a matter of the public record. Tom Hardwick did a study showing that some journals, they weren't actually making the stage 1s publicly available on OSF or otherwise. I personally believe in open peer review. I don't mean that everyone should sign their review. I realize there's issues with that. But the review should be open so that the scientific process is transparent and open, and anyone can evaluate how that process went. Well, this is all part of the open science movement, but often these registered reports are behind huge paywalls. Or the other way around, you have to pay enormous APCs to make them open, which again is anti-science. What about existing data? There might be data sets out there which a researcher hasn't had access to, but they have some analysis in mind, and it would actually be very beneficial to plan that analysis in advance so you don't get these hindsight biases I was talking about in the beginning. But as the registered reports originally set up, that would be forbidden. We were very strict. The data must not exist yet. But then you're losing out on all the potential benefits of this way of thinking. And then the final issue I mention is because in registered reports, there's a detailed process of designing the studies that happens in the publication process. That can conflict with the process of designing studies and getting them approved in order to get a grant. So it would be better if it was all one process. The process of getting the stage one accepted is the process of getting the grant money. And there are a number of schemes like Templeton and others in other areas that are doing precisely that, but journals often don't like to work that way. I must admit, I'm a bit mystified why, but for example, Oxford University Press said, we consider it a conflict of interest if we have this sort of arrangement with a particular funder that will publish a paper if it gets accepted at stage one, that they'll get money from the funder. Slightly mystified, but that is the way that publishers often argue. Now, I just want to add one more thing. You all know that for-profit publishers basically scam us. We do 99% of the work, yet they have the biggest profit margins of any industry. It's a moral issue because it's what? It's taxpayer money, it's charity money paying for their jacuzzis rather than research and education, which is what that money was meant to go on. So there came a time when I was doing a lot of editorial work. In fact, most of what I was doing was editorial. So I was working very hard at spending a lot of time reading papers and doing editorial things. And I thought, why should I do this for profit? Why should I be contributing to a process which is actually sort of anti-science in a way, because it's a principle of science that anybody should be able to contribute to the scientific process, depending only on the quality of their ideas, not, for example, whether they come from a rich country or a rich institution. So, I mean, I say it's not necessarily the just the poor countries and poor institutions I'm talking about. Some cognitive neuroscientists at University of Sussex were telling me, because Sussex doesn't have a deal with some publisher, they can't publish freely in the top fMRI journals unless they get the grant money that covers those APCs. And sometimes they get money to do the research, but not the APCs, not enough to pay all those APCs. So they simply can't publish in the best journals. And that isn't really science at that point. Well, you probably know the story of NeuroImage. And I think they charge around 2,000 euros or something like that for APCs. And because it did so well, the editors had done such a good job. Elsevier, I think it was Elsevier who ran that, said, well, market forces say we need to increase to something like 2,500, which seemed a funny way to operate for an outfit that had been doing a good job, was to punish its authors by charging them more, not to go to science, but just because Elsevier can, to pay for their jacuzzis. So they left en masse for two of those fMRI journals and went to MIT Press, which is a non-for-profit. And that's not the only story of that type of en masse walkouts by editors. That's happening more and more. And I decided 2 years ago that I just didn't want to be part of that for-profit system. So I don't review, so I quit Cortex. So that was slightly sad because working with registered reports in Cortex, which was the outfit that got registered reports going and had pioneered some of the, the best way of doing registered reports up until that point in time. But I thought I'm not going to review, edit, or author for a journal run by for-profit unless it's a society journal. So there's at least some money trickling down to the academics. So that was a personal decision. I'm a professor. So it's kind of easy for me to do, but what I thought I'd do, so, what you do is up to you, but at least I just want to tell you that's what I do. And you can decide on the extent you want to follow anything close to that. But the only reason one could do that, or that I could do that, is if there's an alternative. So is there an alternative? So this brings me to peer community in. So around about 2020, Chris Chambers, Karina Logan, and I were in London at some open science workshop, and we happened to be chatting. And Karina said, I do work for this platform, Peer Community In. It runs a number of, it's basically, at that time, it was essentially biology communities. Each community you could think of as a journal, like there's one for ecology and some other things. It operates like a journal in the sense that there's a board of an editorial board, they call them recommenders, that do the work that a journal does. It takes submissions, sends them out to review, and you go back and forth until they're accepted or rejected, or recommended, as they say. But the point about it is that this operates on preprints. So the author puts a preprint up, and then with the submission to the peer community and relevant community, it involves giving a link to the preprint. And then what the peer community and community does when it's accepted it is it writes a short sort of news and views summary of the paper and the fact that they've accepted it with a link to the preprint of the accepted version. Now that means it's technically not published by peer community in. It's not published, it's linking to a preprint, even though all the academic intellectual work has been done. And that means the paper can still be published by a regular journal afterwards. So that system was already in operation, and Karina Logan, Chris Chambers, and I said, well, why don't we do this for registered reports? So we set up peer community and registered reports. Now, you might say, why would anybody do that? Why would you submit to this system if in order to get a publication in a regular prestige journal, which is what you want, you'd have to go through it all over again? That wouldn't make any sense, or not much sense. So this is the trick. What we have is peer community and registered reports friendly journals. What they do is they say, we trust your editorial standards sufficiently that once you've accepted it, peer community and they've accepted it, that means we automatically will accept it too, without further peer review. So that means once you've been through it with us, you don't need to go through the process again with the journal. They might ask for some formatting changes, but it has to just be minor formatting or house style changes. No regular review or any substantial changes. That's the deal. You do have to pay APCs for that journal. And you do have to satisfy the requirements of that journal. For example, if they have a certain power requirement, a certain significance level, certain base factor level, you have to satisfy that and the remit of the journal. But we in peer community and make the judgment as to whether those further requirements have been satisfied. So a journal cannot look at a paper and say, oh, I think that's sexy or that's not sexy enough, and accept or reject. They cannot do that because they're given the responsibility to peer community into making those judgments. So these so far are our friendly journals. There's 34 of them. Actually, I had to update this morning because we got the 34th this morning. So this is a growing list. And for example, Royal Society Open Science is there, that publishes in all areas of science. So there's definitely an outlet somewhere there for any research you're doing. You see Psychology of Consciousness is there. That's an APA journal. Psychology of Consciousness said, will you be an associate editor for us? And I said, well, I will, if you take registered reports and if you go through peer community in registered reports in order to do that process. So the discussion went up through APA committees, and they said, okay, we'll do a pilot with Psychology of Consciousness. As long as that pilot works, we'll then roll it out for all APA journals. And there's no reason why it wouldn't work. So this list will be growing all the time. Now, because of that, that's the trick, because once you've been through us, you then get a choice of journals afterwards. And as long as there's a journal on that list that you're happy with, then you should be happy to go through peer community in, right, in terms of conventional criteria. So I think that's why it's different from sort of other experiments with reviewing preprints and that sort of thing. We have an exponentially sort of growing number of submissions. So far, in the last bit over, well, 2.5 years, we've accepted 115 stage 1s and 32 stage 2s. We also constantly recruit recommenders. That's our term for editors. So we have 104. So this is a genuine community. And you as an author have certain rights you don't have with normal journals. For example, you can say if there are any recommenders you don't want to deal with your journal, with your submission, as well as any reviewers you don't. So opposed reviewers is standard, opposed editors is not standard. But you can do that with us. And then at the end of it, you choose which journal you publish in. We have also a category of interested journals which say, we like the process, but we don't want to commit yet to giving all editorial control to peer community in. So we want to be alerted to what comes out of it. We have had papers we've accepted in peer community and the author's approached by Nature to say, we're interested in your paper, would like to consider it. We also want to create a system that is superior to the for-profit, what the for-profit journals do, and in fact leave them in the dust. So we have programmatic registered reports in which a whole set of studies can be done in one go, and then they could later be published as a series of different papers or as one paper. But it means the lengthy process of the discussion has already happened. And if something needs to be revised for study 2 in the light of study 1, that can be a quick to and fro with the editor. If it's major, we'll go back to review, but it often isn't, and that means you can get a whole bunch of studies and papers out in one go. We have what's called scheduled review, where what happens is the authors send in a snapshot, just one side, 1 or 2 sides, saying basically what they're planning to write a paper on. And they say, in 5 weeks' time, we will have written the paper. We say, good. We will send the snapshot out to reviewers and get them in a particular 5-day window in 5 weeks' time and say, do you guarantee you'll review it in those 5 days? And we get reviewers who say yes. And so far, that process has been working in that we've gotten reviewers to do it in a few days. So that means by the time the authors submit, it just takes a few days to get the reviews back. So that dramatically speeds up reviewing time, and hence the most lengthy stage of publishing papers. Of course, second review time isn't like that, but at least the most difficult first review time is already dealt with. We train to be a recommender, you have to study how all this works, the philosophy of the peer community of registered reports, and take a test, an online test, which takes about an hour to do. And basically everyone fails that, more or less everyone fails that test first time they take it. I failed the test the first time I took it, and I helped construct the principles by which it was written. Because we want our reviewers to understand how things work. For example, we could say, which of the following is not one of the stage 1 criteria for a registered report evaluation? Like PCI RR, scientific validity of the research question, the importance of the research question, soundness and feasibility of the methodology. The answer is the importance. So we don't judge papers on the importance. We regard that as a subjective criterion. You know, the lady, the Hungarian lady, got the Nobel Prize for her work with mRNA, which led to the mRNA vaccines. Well, 10 years ago or something like that, when she was working on this on this work which led to this amazing breakthrough, she was demoted at a university because they said this is trivial and tedious, old-fashioned stuff. You should be working on something important. So we take importance to be something that shouldn't be quickly decided by some editor. But we do want the research to be scientifically valid. By which I mean we might rule out something like someone says, I want to do a test whether if you put razor blades in pyramids, they'll become sharper. There was such a claim floating around. We might say that's not science. There's no scientific research program that leads to predictions like this. So that could be rejected. But not But as long as we're judging its genuine science, we're not going to reject it on the basis of our judgment of how interesting it is. Now, the other thing we do as well is, let's say data already exist. We allow registered reports on that, but we're going to explicitly mark how well bias is being controlled. So the gold standard is what we call bias control level 6, which is the data don't exist yet. That's classic. The data don't exist. So the bias control is maximal in that sense. But let's say there's a data set that's there, but hasn't been made available yet, or maybe not available to that researcher. Well, there's still a fair degree of bias control there, but we'll mark it as a level 5 or lower, just to say there may be a slight risk here we want to explicitly recognize, but let's go ahead with the process. For example, you might want to analyze data sets of existing fMRI data. And there can be an advantage to that. And maybe, for example, one level of bias control is you analyze part of the data set, but you haven't had access to the full data set. So we recognize that with a degree of bias control. So that's it, basically. So what I want to say is there is an alternative to the conventional way of publishing. And that conventional way of publishing with the for-profits may have been in our interest, you know, when it was set up in the 50s, because, well, they did things we couldn't do, like the marketing and the distribution and the dissemination and so on. But now we do everything online. We don't really need them. And the peer community is a platform. And we do have a programmer because we need to program in the workflow for registered reports and so on. But it really doesn't cost very much at all to run. We do get donations from 150 universities. It started with French universities, in fact, and now they're all over the world, and research institutes. And the result is a publication process which is free for authors, free for readers. It takes a pittance to run, which is easily dealt with by small donations from a reasonable number of universities. So I think that's a model of scientific publishing, which the registered reports experiment shows can work. And what I think would be good would be to set up that model, because I would like to publish everything I do, not just registered reports, but standard articles, through a process like that, not through what we have now. There is a peer community in psychology in the process of being discussed, but you might want to set up peer community in cognitive neuroscience, something like this. The knack to getting that working is you want the best people, the best editors on the peer community and board, so that when you approach journals to be your friendly journals, we say, we have the top people. Of course, you have to trust. This is what happened with registered reports, because Chris Chambers was the driving force of registered reports. The editorial board for peer community was the editorial board for Cortex, for Royal Society Open Science, for many other journals. They can't say to us, we don't trust your editorial judgment. They had to trust it because we are the people who do it, even for the journals. So if you can replicate that situation with, say, fMRI, cognitive neuroscience, then there's no reason at all why that couldn't work. And we could set up these communities for all the disciplines that you want to publish in. And that would save enormous billions of money, which could then be plowed back into permanent jobs for yourself. And things that would be good for science rather than jacuzzis for publishers. All right, thanks very much.